So in the novel City of Bones, Cassandra Clare creates an intricately imagined world of demons and the people who are sworn to hunt them. It is a young adult novel that became a movie and a television series, and has since publication sold, I believe, 30 million copies. It is a cultural phenomenon and a fun read, and I actually was pointed to it by a youth member. Now, in this world, heroine Clary Frey is a normal 15-year-old who goes to a party with her best friend Simon. In the midst of flashing, multicolored lights and thudding music, she sees three teens with strange markings all over their bodies lead a blue-haired boy to a back room. Leaving her best friend on the dance floor, she snakes behind them, curiosity getting the best of her. Peering through the door, she sees an argument ensue. Eventually, one of the teenagers with the markings takes out a knife and stabs the blue-haired boy. Writhing in agony, he swears vengeance as he disappears into smoke and ash. Shocked, Clary wonders what she has just witnessed. A murder, apparently, but what sort of person just vanishes like that? Clary is soon to learn about the world of the shadow hunters, where men and women and apparently teenagers are sworn to rid the earth of demons. And Clary is soon to learn that she is one of them. Another very different show, House of Cards. There are no supernatural figures in this one, and the sober political drama could not be more different than the at times whimsical world of City of Bones. In this show, Frank Underwood plots his rise through various political machinations until he becomes President of the United States. In the show, every interaction that Underwood has with other people is transactional. In other words, he only bothers interacting with someone if he believes that he can use them. And if someone gets in his way, he destroys them. Underwood was, of course, played by Kevin Spacey until his departure from the show due to his own transactional use of other people. He was let go for sexual misconduct, but that's another story and another sermon. In one of the most harrowing scenes from the second season of House of Cards, Frank lures a young reporter into a subway station with the promise of an interview. Now, I'm giving a spoiler here, so close your ears if you were planning to watch this and you haven't. This reporter had been tracking Frank and is beginning to uncover some of his abuses of power. Thinking that she can get to the bottom of the story by meeting with the then vice president, Frank Underwood, she consents. The station is dimly lit with concrete walls and plain gray tile. As the trains whir by, the two of them have a heated exchange, and she refuses to budge from pursuing her story. And just as the next train is rushing in, Frank gives her a hard shove and she falls onto the tracks. She is hit by the train and dies instantly. Frank walks out by another way as if nothing had happened. Now, I went to a Lutheran elementary school where Satan was a frequent subject of the religious education curriculum. I remember getting multiple lectures on the devil. The one positive thing that I can say about those lessons is that they were a lot more interesting than having to memorize the books of the Bible, which I can still recite to you in order. Anyway, in one of those classes, the teacher handed out a worksheet. It said at the top, "Who do you think Satan is?" And then underneath it, it had something like 5 or 6 answers. One was a force for evil, but not a real being. Another was a real being who is actively leading people into temptation. A third option was that Satan is an old idea that no longer has any meaning. The image at the bottom of this sheet showed a winged monster whispering to a little boy who was contemplating whether to steal candy from the store. Now, I don't remember which option I checked on that sheet, except that I did not pick the one where Satan is an outdated idea, because that would have meant a conversation with the teacher that I did not wish to have. It's interesting to ask where most Americans are on this question. As it turns out, we have an answer to that. Surveys have charted religious belief in the United States for decades, and one of those beliefs that has remained relatively consistent is that over half of all Americans believe that Satan is a real being. They would probably be comfortable with the universe that Cassandra Clare created in City of Bones, where demons slip in and out of the world at will. We don't, however, know whether those same survey responders who believe in demons imagine them to have blue hair and be hunted by teenagers, but, those surveys only get us so far. This is quite different from where liberal religion has landed on the question of Satan. Following the lead of science and reason, liberal theology has banished Satan and the demonic to the world of fantasy literature. Optimistic about the potential of human beings, liberal theology has deemed all that talk about evil and Satan to be part of our dreary and benighted past. Bad things happen in the world not because a red guy shows up with a tail and a pitchfork, but instead because human beings are frail, or natural law takes its course, or some other natural explanation happens. And if the devil ever does make an appearance at a Unitarian Universalist congregation, it is going to be during the March of the Goblins, somewhere between Scooby-Doo and Elsa from Frozen. By the way, one member who, upon seeing my sermon title, said that this is probably as close to a fire and brimstone sermon that she'll ever hear, and she's probably right. In any case, Old Scratch, which is my favorite name for the devil, by the way, he doesn't seem to mind his demotion to the world of fiction and literature. His literary forms range from the terrifying to the shabby to the classy. In one of the first Gothic novels, The Monk, which appeared in 1796, Satan was portrayed first as a beautiful young angel that fell from heaven, and then later in the novel as a monstrous winged creep. At just about the same time, Goethe published his Faustus, which we heard a little excerpt from earlier, and that featured a much more modern Satan. This time, he was a sophisticated gentleman ready to strike a bargain. What's on the line, of course, is your soul. You even get Satans in fiction who are somewhat lovable and maybe even a little bit sad, such as in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. There he seems more like an endearing uncle rather than the Prince of Darkness. But whatever the particular form, it was in this realm, the realm of literary imagination, that Satan was able to maintain his status as an independent spiritual agent whose currency is human souls. In order for demons to survive outside of that realm of literature, for most people, they had to become internal. They had to become metaphors. Modern interpretation has made them into psychological forces. Since at least the time of Freud, there has been a move to interpret the residence of demons as being in the human mind and heart. They are a part of us, of our inner lives and our personal interactions. This, I think, is what we see represented in House of Cards. There, Frank Underwood is a character that lacks any reference to some kind of bigger cosmic order. There's no overt theological framing behind what he's doing in that show, and yet evil radiates from him and contaminates his interactions. His lust for power and the destruction of those who enter his orbit are central features to the television series. One commentator even noticed that Underwood's assistant, Doug Stanton, is something like the devil's imp, willing to do his master's bidding at any cost. In this show, person after person ends up used, manipulated, or destroyed. It's a modern psychosocial take on the story of the devil. There's no grand cosmic reality to reinforce the scene. The demonic is wholly internalized into the mind and actions of the central character. Now, Steven Pinker is a Harvard psychologist and social scientist who would probably prefer that internalized House of Cards approach over the fantastical world of the City of Bones. His magisterial book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, makes the somewhat counterintuitive and surprising case that societies are actually getting less violent and more peaceful. Overall, Pinker reports good news in his book. But in one section, he charts the obstacles that we human beings face to seeing violence and cruelty decline. And this is what he calls the inner demons. As the name might suggest, he's not interested in theological rationales for violence, but rather wants to understand the inner workings of the human mind and the inner workings of human dynamics that cause violence. He names 5 inner demons that contribute to our worst impulses, which he names instrumental violence, which is violence deployed as a means to an end; dominance, which is an urge for glory, power, or authority over others; revenge, which is simply the desire for punishment and retribution. If that was the devil calling, tell him I've got this. He doesn't need to. Then there's sadism, which is taking pleasure in another person's suffering. And finally, ideology, which justifies unlimited violence through a shared belief system that some great good will come as the result of violence. Pinker makes the point that by looking at these demons as inward forces, we have greater ability to mitigate their worst effects. For example, we might be able to reject the reasoning that leads to some of these impulses in the first place. Both instrumental violence and ideology, for example, rely on the notion that people or groups of people can be manipulated to accomplish some end. Theories of history, no less than political leaders, have relied on the disposal of certain groups for their own ends. And yet many religious traditions, ours included, reject this notion and argue that a human life should never be treated as an object, as a thing that is there for our disposal. Catching this insidious reasoning early and fighting it with a strong moral compass is the best medicine for preventing such demonic notions from taking hold of the human heart. The demon of revenge follows a different brain circuitry, but it can be no less dangerous. Brain scans have shown that a unique neurological pathway lights up in the brain during revenge fantasies, and this makes that particular demon very difficult to exorcise. Pinker says that this circuitry probably developed from long evolutionary patterning. If I take revenge on you for something that you did, you will be less likely to think that you can harm me or my kin in the future. People who thought that way were rewarded with survival, which is why many find pleasure in entertaining that demon of revenge, Pinker says. But like the children's story and the meditation that Mandy and Jonathan did just a little bit earlier, we find that our most threatening demons do not have absolute power over us. We can mindfully acknowledge them, feel them, and refuse to act upon them. And what Pinker and other social scientists have shown, that's what often makes their power over us weaker. And I guess that's the good news. Because if there's always a potential for our inner demons to materialize, then there is also the potential for our better angels to make an appearance, for us to act courageously in service to a more hopeful world. Remember, just because the devil shows up doesn't mean that you have to sign his contract. My spiritual companions, amen. I love you, and happy Halloween.